Live from the European Parliament here in Strasbourg, this is Raw Politics. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have coming up for you. Calling for a united Europe. Jean-Claude Juncker's hopeful plea in his final State of the Union speech. He's in denial, that's according to his critics, as divisions deepen over issues such as migration and the rise of the right. And on that note, MEPs vote to take action against Hungary for undermining democracy. And we also have new rules for tech companies regarding terror propaganda. And the moment not to miss, Brexit romance as Nigel Farage gives President Juncker a parting gift. Well, it's time to meet our panel for tonight. I'm joined by Ryan Heath, political editor at Political Europe. Ryan, which of these stories are you interested in?
Orban, he's the real story of this week. Juncker, interesting, but Orban is the one who wrote the script for the State of the Union, which is that it's very fragile at the moment.
Indeed, we'll talk about that. And we are also joined by Marietje Schaker. She's a Dutch MEP with the Alliance for Liberals and Democrats and is also the vice chair on the delegation for U.S. relations. What about you? Which story stands out?
Well, I agree with Ryan that the most fundamental vote we also took today is on Hungary and the rule of law, the fact that it needs to be respected, because without that foundation we can talk all we want about Europe in the world and all the agenda points, but it's really the fundamentals that need to be in order.
All right, absolutely. We will get into that, but first, unity, sovereignty, one voice. Jean-Claude Juncker's final State of the Union here in Strasbourg today had a clear theme. The President of the European Commission pleaded for an end to what he called the sorry spectacle of a divided Europe. And he stressed the importance of a united EU. But then hours later, some would argue that arguably the real State of the Union emerged, with MEPs voting to discipline one of their own, as you both were mentioning, by triggering Article 7 against Hungary. And we will get into that story in just a bit. But first, Jean-Claude Juncker's last State of the Union address.
European sovereignty can never be to the detriment of others. Europe is a continent of openness and tolerance. It will remain so. Europe will never be a fortress, turning its back on the world or those suffering within it. Europe is not an island. I call on the Council Presidency to now make the decisive step to broker a sustainable solution on migration reform.
We also ask the British government to understand that someone who leaves the Union cannot be in the same privileged position as a member state. If you leave the Union, you are, of course, no longer part of our single market. The
Commission will resist all attacks on the rule of law. We continue to be very concerned by the developments in some of our member states. Article 7 must be applied whenever the rule of law is threatened.
Well, the State of the Union address also included some key announcements. Juncker called for a new partnership with Africa that would see 10 million jobs created in 5 years. He also promised new rules to protect elections from external manipulation. And he also took aim at plastics, calling for a new anti-plastics law. He called for a clock changing as well, saying that member states decide whether to live in summer or winter time. All right, well, let's discuss what Jean-Claude Juncker said today. Ryan, we were talking before the program started, and you had your opinion on the whole speech, in fact. What do you think?
I think it was haphazard. I didn't see a lot of energy. There are some nice sentiments in that speech, but if you compare Juncker and how he defends Europe with his spokesperson, Margarita Skinas, will come on with a lot more energy in a few minutes and defend him compared to what Juncker was saying today, or other people who are passionate about the project. He felt very flat today, like you were giving a history lesson rather than really going in with a political punch.
Yeah, so, just with insight, because you used to be a speechwriter. How does that happen if a speech like this comes out?
It's a really difficult process. So when I wrote one of these State of the Union speeches, 17 drafts before a president even looked at it. It's a mess. There are lots of people that want to have input. So you really need a president who's going to take control and put a lot of thinking in advance. And I think some of the ideas in the speech, the border police, the partnership with Africa, these are great ideas. They would have been a lot better if they were happening 3 years ago. It's not like the migration crisis is a new thing. It's not like we didn't know that governments and the EU needed to be in control of Europe's borders.
Marietje, what stood out for you in that entire speech?
Well, I agree it was haphazard. It was really jumping between topics, but I was really sitting at the tip of my seat when Jean-Claude Juncker started talking about Syria. We are really witnessing a looming bloodbath in Idlib, and he said we cannot be bystanders. And I fundamentally agree. Europe cannot be a bystander when these terrible events are bound to happen, and we need to intervene, but then nothing came. And so I think it really underlines the fact that we are not strong enough of a global player, that we do not have our defense cooperation in order. And so I thought it was challenging to see where there was agendas and where there were assessments of actual weak points that we urgently need to fix.
So you both bring up the same point, where you said that could have been an idea 3 years ago. You said nothing has really changed. Europe is not doing much. So what kind of legacy is Jean-Claude Juncker leaving? Was this a legacy speech, and what does it say about him?
It was somewhat of a backward-looking speech, not only a forward-looking speech. I think, unfortunately for Juncker, some of his legacy is going to be around Brexit. It's not that he's personally to blame for it necessarily, but you can't escape that that's the big rupture happening during his time as European Commission President. One of the other things that people don't talk about a lot, but that has worked well from meeting your objective standpoint, is reducing the amount of legislation that comes out of the Commission. That's a clear change from the previous Commission. And then his investment plan, this idea where you leverage finance through the European Investment Bank rather than just give euro for euro grants out of the EU budget. That's a very clear success, and it's a model for what's going to happen in this Africa partnership. So in a way, he's saying, this worked in Europe, let's go and give that opportunity to Africa.
Yeah, what do you think about those new measures that he announced? So do you see the partnership with Africa, for example, or strengthening borders? Are you optimistic? Or what do you think about that?
Well, I think looking at Europe's position in the world is very, very urgent. There is a real, power play between China, that's very active in Africa, the US, that is changing direction under the leadership of President Trump. So it's urgent that we claim our position and a values-based position in the world. But indeed, the partnership with Africa, developments in Africa and the need for the EU to be involved can hardly be called new. They're very urgent still, but I hope that, 10 million jobs, it's a good target, but there's a lot more we can do towards sustainability, towards trade, towards security, and towards providing for a package of measures that give people better opportunities. And maybe that will help towards reducing migration.
Right. The speech might not have had the punch you were talking about, but then we had some reactions from MEPs in the chamber. So let's take a look.
Is the European Union in a better shape now than it was when you took office? And I think the answer is clear. No. There has never been a time in the history of European integration where Europe was more disunited than it is now.
My proposal is, Jean-Claude, be ambitious. You have said, and that will be my conclusion, that this was in fact the Commission of the last chance. You remember that, 4 years ago. And I'm always asking myself, what can come after the Commission of the last chance in the coming years? So I think what will come is something different. The Commission that we need in the future, dear colleagues, will be more than that. It will be a type of a new, renewed European government, what we need.
Well, Mr. Juncker, what a picture you paint. A European Union of peace, of prosperity, of contentedness. And as you said, you're trying to make it a little more perfect every day. Well, it's a very good advertising slogan, but tell you what surprised me. Since your last State of the Union speech, there's been a seismic political event in Europe, perhaps one even on a par with Brexit. Italy, a founding member of the Union, the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, now has a coalition government between the Five Stars and Lega that is polling over 60% of the vote and is posing a direct challenge, both in terms of the management of the Eurozone and indeed how the migration crisis is handled. You made no acknowledgement of that at all. No acknowledgement of the populist revolt. I noted your continued use of the phrase sovereign Europe. What you're talking about is a deeper centralisation of power.
So there we have it. Very interesting discussions in what MEPs are saying. Do you think that the criticism is fair? I'll put it to you, Marietje, as an MEP, that he's in denial, Jean-Claude Juncker, about what has actually been achieved?
Well, I do think that this is very much a policy speech that doesn't necessarily resonate with the average European. And I think that is the task ahead of us. We have an election year coming up, and I think it is crucial that also members of European Parliament that may want to be re-elected will go out there and show that Europe adds value, can come up with solutions that are close to people, and give Europe color for people, not in technicalities, not in budget lines, but really in solutions that matter for people and that can take some of the concerns away. Because I think if we look at Europe today, we see a lot of challenges, and part of the population thinks that Europe is part of the problem, and another part can see Europe as part of the solution. And so it is crucial that we can make that link to people everywhere in Europe that are not used to talking in policy terms or in speech words. And that, I do believe, is a challenge for all of us. And that didn't really come across. With the lack of energy, it wasn't really visionary, it wasn't really touching the heart. It was rather a list of talking points.
Yes, so because some of the people that we had on the panel in the past couple of days were saying that what Europe needs now is vision.
Yeah.
And we did see that, did we?
No, and it doesn't have to be a big, huge general vision. He could have looked the camera straight down the barrel and said to the people of Italy who might be doubting the EU, here's 3 reasons why you shouldn't give up on the EU. And here's one thing that I'm going to do in the next 12 months, my final 12 months, to make sure you can still believe in Europe like I believe in Europe. And I just didn't feel that come across at all.
Right, and speaking of opinions, as you both were raising, our team in the Cube in Lyon have been looking into this. Let's cross over to them. What do you have for us?
Hello to you, Tessa. Well, obviously, everyone looking at the elder statesman of Europe, as some people see Jean-Claude Juncker. But what about the young voices of Europe? What about the next generation of Europeans? What do they have to say? Well, here in the Cube, we've been reaching out to a lot of young people from the European Youth Forum. Now, they're obviously, as you can imagine, quite engaged in wanting to debate about the future of Europe. And they were really keenly watching this speech. Let's just bring you up some of what they had to say here. This is Karina. She's 28 years old, and she's from Austria. Now, for her, Jean-Claude Juncker touched on youth unemployment, which was a key issue. But for her view, anyway, it didn't go far enough. Let's hear what she had to say.
The European Union is slowly recovering from the financial crisis. Youth unemployment might be lower than it was some years ago. But we also need to ensure that young people have quality jobs and also have access to social rights, and that their social rights are protected.
So an idea here that, yes, Jean-Claude Juncker might have touched upon it, but he didn't go far enough in actually dealing with it. I think we're hearing that from the panel discussion there. Well, there's Andre here in Belgium, and for him it was climate change, talking about it, but what was the action? Let's see what he had to say.
In the State of the European Union, Juncker talked a lot about climate change. He talked a lot, but he didn't promise any action, and action is what we young people need. Because if we're not doing it now, the problems are only getting worse, and future generations need to deal with it.
Let me just finally end with you on Kristen here. Now, Kristen, she is 25. She's from Estonia. And for her, the future of Europe is about getting young people elected and more involved in that way. Let's hear what she had to say.
President Juncker called for next year to be a landmark for democracy. This can only happen if all citizens are equally part of this process and barriers to young people's participation are removed. Political parties need to give real electable positions to young candidates, and candidates and parties in their programs need to speak about issues that matter to young voters.
So that's just a flavour of what some young people are saying in Estonia, in Austria, in Belgium. But Tessa, as you're saying there's a lot of opinions going around. And I think a lot of people feel Jean-Claude Juncker delivered a speech that didn't really offer much in the way of substance that they wanted to hear.
All right, thank you for that, Alex and our Cube team. Well, joining me now, someone who knows a lot about communicating the Commission's message to Europeans, Margaritis Skinas, the chief spokesperson for the EU Commission, and also with us, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor here at Euronews. I will begin with you, Margaritis. I mean, the young people were saying that, well, you know what, Europe is not actually talking to us or doing something for us, anything for us. What do you think?
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that Europe is a diverse entity of 28 member states, of almost 500 million people. You cannot talk to everybody at the same time with the same message. What was important today, I think, in the President's speech is that he struck the right balance between a rather pragmatic assessment of the political and economic situation around us in Europe, but also a quite punchy, visionary view of what is to come in the next 14 months of this Commission. I think he struck the right balance. It was a very Junckerite speech, if I may. It was Juncker himself speaking. And I think the overwhelming reactions that we saw, both here in the European Parliament, in the national capitals and across Europe, are very encouraging.
We just heard our guest earlier who was saying actually it wasn't that punchy and there wasn't a lot of vision. And so how do you say that is actually communicating to Europeans?
I just happened to see that there was an overwhelming positive reception from heads of state and government across the
Heads of state, but not your voters, your citizens, the young people.
I have seen in the European Parliament the presidents of all major pro-European groups saluting the approach of the president. Of course, Ryan and few journalists will never be happy with what we produce at the Commission, but I think the overall reception was good. And probably
Darren.
How dare you? We'd never be happy. I think Margarita's point about the balance, and it was a balanced speech, is part of the problem. So you've got people like Guy Verhofstadt saying it was not ambitious enough, he wants more ambition. For people like Nigel Farage and Eurosceptics, it goes too far. And that is the fundamental problem in many ways where the European Union finds itself. Europe's facing many big issues at the moment. Big issues like migration, big issues such as the rise of populism and the far right. And for voters are falling into two camps. Those that think that Europe is the answer, and a growing number of people who think that Europe is part of the problem. And the problem is that in that speech, there was no real addressal to the people who feel that Europe is increasingly part of the problem. There was a kind of sense of denial that is happening.
I beg to disagree with that, if you allow me, because what President Juncker put forward today was not an abstract, empty vision. It was full of meat. There was lots of specific policy proposals. There was lots about the Europe that protects, about external borders, about putting together our resources where our problems are, about buying an insurance contract against those who want to interfere in the European elections of next year. Concrete proposals on cybersecurity, subsidiarity, a new deal for Africa. These are major policy proposals.
But not in a way that would...
Yeah, I think in the sense that, in the grand scheme of things, that, this speech was not going to change your impression of the European Union.
But Darren, you must have had your impression because...
We did. And I managed to grab a short while with Jean-Claude Juncker at lunchtime. And this is what he had to say in a very brief interview. Let's have a look.
4 years ago, you stood up and said you wanted to be frank, that Europe was not in a good state. Surely 4 years later, under your stewardship, it's got worse.
No, that's the way some of our British colleagues in Parliament are presenting things. I don't think that things have developed in a bad direction. We have growth, 21 trimester following one the other. The unemployment has gone down, the budgetary deficit went down, investment is at a level where it was during the crisis. So I don't share the view of those who are saying that everything is dark. There is sunshine somewhere.
There are problems though, migration, Brexit, populism.
Yes, but...
Aren't you in denial a little bit?
No, not at all. I'm not naive. I know exactly where the problems do exist. Populism is a problem. Brexit is a disaster, and the fact that member states were unable to agree on the basic answers to be given to the migration problem is making me sad. That's not the Commission, because the Commission made its proposals in March 2015. If member states, all of the member states, would have been as wise as the Commission was 4 years ago, things would have developed in a different way.
On Brexit, there's talk from Michel Barnier, from others in Britain, that a deal can be done in 6 to 8 weeks. Do you think a deal will be done?
I share the views of Michel Barnier.
And one final question, in one word, what's your biggest regret of your presidency?
The fact that the European institutions were unable to bridge the differences between East and West.
All right, Darren, what was your main takeaway from that?
I think it's interesting. We heard this in the speech as well. It's like potential passing of the buck, or a recognition at least of reality, that the Commission can't be blamed for everything, and that Jean-Claude Juncker can't be blamed for all the problems in the European Union. Okay, we'll make that fair point. But isn't that also part of the problem? That, you know, this is a union made of lots of countries, but also lots of institutions, and that whoever is president, their hands are constantly tied.
Well, but this is what the European Union is all about. This is not Washington, this is Brussels. We have a division of power where decision-making authorities shared between institutions and the capitals. I'm aware that there are many expectations bestowed upon the Commission emerging as a system that can decide to do and undo things, but reality, institutional reality, is much more complex than that. We have proposals to defend, we have MEPs to convince, we have capitals to win over. So I understand this, at times it's a mixture of self-flagellation and increased expectations, but that's life around us.
It is, and that's democracy to a degree, but it's also the Achilles heel of the European Union. You know, Ryan was talking earlier on about migration. You know, this is something potentially that should have been in place 3 years ago, not now. And that I think is what Europeans are crying out for. They want solution to these big problems, and the European Union might be able to provide them, but it will be years down the line simply because no one institution can ever take the lead at any one time.
If you allow me a comment on this 3 years ago thing. 3 years ago, we laid the groundwork for an EU migration policy that worked. We have saved 700,000 people in the Mediterranean. We have reduced the flows by 94% in the Aegean and 80% in the central Mediterranean. We have a system of hotspots that can distinguish asylum seekers from those that need to be returned. All this is there.
But you've also seen a massive increase in public opinion against migration, and people who think it's being mishandled.
Yes, because the people who think it's being mishandled are misinformed by certain national governments that they want to Europeanize failure and nationalize success. Okay. And this is costing us.
Margaritis, you worked really closely with Jean-Claude Juncker. In one word, how would you describe his legacy? One word.
One word. Mr. Europe working for the common interest of all.
That's a lot of words. All right,
it's quite difficult.
Indeed.
We'll give him that.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Now, let's move on. An unlikely bromance seems to be burgeoning in the chamber of the European Parliament, but it looks like it might be a case of unrequited love. Let's take a look at today's Power Play. That was fun.
Well, Nigel Farage told me afterwards that it was Union Jack socks.
Right.
He'd been wearing them a few months ago, that Jean-Claude Juncker had admired them, and so his leaving present.
Tell us a behind-the-scene context. I mean, he didn't want it?
We haven't opened the box yet.
Okay, well, now you know it's in it.
Now I will talk
to
Natasha Berthaud, who gets the box, and she will tell me, I'm
sure. The funny thing is that actually, as much as they probably would not like to admit it, Nigel Farage and Jean-Claude Juncker actually have an awful lot in common.
Indeed,
they're very similar characters in many ways.
They kind of do like each other, indeed. All right, thank you very much for that, especially for being here, Margarita Skinas. Now, we have a lot more coming out for you on Raw Politics. Tech companies face a tight new deadline for removing terror content. Plus, a first for the European Parliament as they use the so-called nuclear option, Article 7, against one of their own. We'll be back. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, this is supposed to be Jean-Claude Juncker's day in the spotlight, his State of the Union address. But perhaps more revealing than anything he had to say is the vote that came just a few hours later. MEPs triggered Article 7, the so-called nuclear option against Hungary. The measure required a two-thirds majority to pass, and it did pass. 448 voted in favor, 197 against, and 48 abstained. Now, Article 7 can lead to a country losing its voting rights if it is deemed to have let democracy or human rights slide. The author of the report, Judith Sargentini, was visibly moved by the result, but Orban's populist allies will be less than pleased. Well, with me to get a handle on what this vote will mean for the EU, Hungary, and Viktor Orban is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. And also joining us for this panel is Jan Zahardil, a Czech MEP who's a member of the European Conservatives and Reformist Group. Jan, I'll start with you. How did you vote and why?
I voted against Hungary to be sanctioned, so I voted against the resolution that would advise to trigger this Article 7 against Hungary. The reason is very obvious. I'm coming from the Czech Republic, Central European country. We have certain, I would say, V4, Visegrad 4 solidarity amongst us. We did a lot of things in common, and I do not believe that this is the right way how to treat a country. Although I could admit that there might be some particular problems, I do not believe that this is the right way how to start a dialogue.
Okay, so do you acknowledge the accusations against Viktor Orban and the way his government is handling democracy and human rights in his country?
Well, I read those accusations. I have to say that when it comes to report of Madame Sargentini, I believe that this was very much influenced by her political affiliation, and I believe that Hungary is a democratic country. It has a democratic elected government. It has a constitution. It has all, international treaties, and it abides to them. So I think that this was pretty inappropriate to vote this way, and it was a kind of rather political punishment, I would say.
Okay, isn't that the point, though, that that's what necessarily the Russians or Vladimir Putin would say, is that we've got democracy, it's just not democracy how you see it. And clearly, the vast majority of MEPs believe that Viktor Orban is breaking the fundamental principles of the European Union.
Yeah, they believe that. I don't believe that, and I definitely would not compare Mr. Orban to Mr. Putin in any way. I think that in Russia we can talk really about a very limited state of democracy. I definitely believe that Hungary is not the case.
But you look at that speech he made yesterday, when he could have been conciliatory, when he could have at least mooted the possibility of compromise, and there was none of that. It was a very defiant tone. It was kind of sticking two fingers up and saying, I'm not going to change. That's not what politics is about. That's not what the European Union is about, surely.
Look, every politician has his own style. Mr. Orban is a fighter. He's a strong man. He understands politics this way. So it is his way how to communicate, and it was his way how to defend. Whether it had some impact on today's vote or not, I can hardly guess.
But this is clearly a message from the vast majority of MEPs that we saw about what Hungary is doing. So it's a message again. But in reality, legally speaking, are they really going to lose their voting rights?
Almost certainly not. It would be extraordinary if they did, not least of all because this is only the start of a process. It's a three-stage process. And at the end, they need essentially all the remaining EU 27 nations to support this. And I would suspect there are one or two in Eastern Europe who won't, not least of all Poland, for example.
Even more.
Maybe even more. And so I think it is incredibly unlikely that sanctions will be in place. That is not to say that clearly Hungary have taken this very seriously. The European Union have taken this very seriously. And it is a very, very strong message. And it is interesting that the Hungarian foreign minister tonight, and indeed some MEPs, are suggesting that essentially it was rigged because, of course, the absentee votes in that parliamentary vote were not included.
When we say that it is a message, but will that be effective? Because this is the first time that the Parliament had triggered it, but the European Commission triggered it last year against Poland, right?
Yep.
But now today, the President has named a new head of the Supreme Court, so basically saying, well, you know what, we're not listening to what.
Yeah, and I think that is potentially fundamentally the problem. Is that I think you accept that there are issues and problems in Hungary. How do you address them? If Viktor Orban is not going to address them, how do you do it?
Well, I'm not Viktor Orban, and I am not responsible for his country, but I definitely believe that the worst possible way how to address them is an attempt to publicly humiliate the country at the plenary of the European Parliament.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much for being with us today on the panel. And we will move on now because there's another hotly anticipated vote today, and that was on copyright. After months of fierce lobbying, the Parliament has spoken, and critics of the reforms, they were not pleased.
Thank you, Mr. President, for letting me speak. This is an enormous strike against freedom of speech on the internet.
Well, in the end, it was a landslide, 438 to 226 in favor of copyright reform with 39 abstentions. The man behind the proposals, Axel Voss, got so excited that he forgot to turn his mic on. Many artists say that the reforms will help their livelihoods, while critics say it could strangle free expression on the web. Now, it was certainly a divisive debate today. Well, coming up after the break, I take a tour of the parliamentary corridors to ask MEPs about the real state of the union. That's after a short break. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, the EU has been increasing pressure on tech firms. It's proposing massive fines for companies that aren't fast enough in removing terrorist content. Now, that is really something interesting. And joining me to discuss this is Darren McCaffrey, political editor at Euronews, and Ryan Heath, political editor at Political Europe. So this is an interesting one here, interesting discussion. So the EU is proposing that if terrorists, so-called terrorist content is not removed within an hour, I believe, then they're going to be fined. What do you think about this?
Yeah, and there's already, I think, legislation in Germany, for example, that says that it needs to be done within 24 hours. So this is pretty draconian, given the fact I think the fine is 4% of your annual turnover. So for Alphabet, which is in charge of Google, for example, and YouTube, I mean, that's running into billions of US dollars. I think it's even well over $1 billion for Facebook. So it is a pretty bold move in some regards from the European Union. Jean-Claude Juncker was very clear earlier on that he thinks that part of the wave of terrorism that we've seen in Europe in recent years is in part due to this dissemination of information on the web, and that it is leading to the radicalisation, particularly of young kids. It does need to be tackled. It needs to be the responsibility of tech companies, and that a fine is the best way to act as a deterrent for them to deal with it. It does raise questions, though, because it's not just going to apply to the big tech companies. Sure. It does apply to everyone, and there will be questions about how it's actually, how it's applied, and also, you know, what is terrorism, and what defines terrorist content. And again, I think that is something. It's going to present a bit of trouble. There is apparently an appeal process that if you think your material has been taken down wrongly, it can be put back up again. But that's clearly damaging for content when it initially goes up.
And also there is that question of who is going to police this content. I mean, have you looked into this, and is there questions or debate around this?
Yeah, what we often find with technology legislation is that there are unintended consequences. So good principles don't translate so well in practice. But what we're really talking about here is the EU's trying to put down a marker and say, you have new terms for your license to operate in Europe. We're not okay with the idea that you as a big company come in, make huge amounts of money, don't necessarily pay huge amounts of tax, don't necessarily employ huge amounts of people, and leave a lot of social disruption in your wake. What they're really asking the tech companies to do is actually just think a bit harder before they implement new systems. Employ a few more people to consider the consequences of what they've unleashed onto society. And then there is the literal direct issue of the terror content. But I think there's several other layers. It's not just actual terror content.
Yeah, and I think in part it is, you know, the European Union's kind of message, which is, yeah, big American tech companies, well, they're allowed to operate in Europe, but they've also got some form of responsibility. Right. Interestingly, what they have done in the UK is that they're increasingly using AI to recognise what terrorist content is. Again, that's got unintended consequences because AI is far from perfect at the moment, but it is an interesting way of combating it.
Yeah, I do want to bring up another issue on this is, as we had with the copyright debate, censorship again versus who identifies, because I think that is really a key issue that who is going to legislate. They're going to give so much control.
Yeah, and one of the reactions may be that tech companies simply apply much harsher filters to what gets online. So they would rather prevent the problem, the question, the fine from occurring than dealing with the reaction that the Commission is demanding. And that's when you get into trouble. That's when people say there is filtering of information that's available online. At the same time, these platforms effectively weaponize information.
Absolutely.
Anyone can put wrong information or violent, terrible information out there now, and that does have consequences too.
And there's another topic, because we just finished a parliamentary session, but then we're looking forward to the Salzburg summit, and I think that's going to be a big deal. Migration was supposed to be on the topic, but Brexit is going to be a big deal.
We cannot get away. We cannot get away from Brexit. Yeah, and it's interesting. The mood music, in many regards, seems to have changed. Well, it did need to, given the fact that we are meant to be 8 to 10 weeks away from a deal, and it need to be more than just the mood music. But there is a feeling, a sense that there's a bit more optimism here in continental Europe, in Strasbourg and Brussels, and that there is a bit more optimism in the UK as well, that a deal can now be struck. That is not to say, though, things are easy for Theresa May. She's had a pretty torrid, again, 24 hours. Lots of rumours last night that a coup was underway amongst hard Brexiteers who were openly talking about trying to remove her as leader. Now, that coup today seems to have been cancelled by people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Ian Duncan-Smith and others. But it is a reminder of what a precarious position Theresa May is in. Nigel Farage earlier on today told me that he thought that the Chequers deal was the most divisive thing in the Conservative Party for 80 years. It was more unpopular than the poll tax. Now, he would say that, and he is exaggerating, but it is clear that this is a very, very sore wound.
Ryan, what about Europe's point of view? Do you think that a deal can be made by mid-November?
It's possible. We know it's not going to be usually, we don't think it will be by the October deadline that was originally set. Let's put it that way. Possible in November, more likely in December. But what I didn't hear today from Jean-Claude Juncker, and what I maybe was expecting, was a little bit more flexibility. There was no suggestion that Michel Barnier is going to get a new mandate to negotiate differently. Everyone was sticking to their mantras that the UK has to have a downgrade in its relationship if it's leaving, and that they had full backing for Michel Barnier. So we're not hearing massively different mood music, and we might need to hear a little bit more of it to guarantee that deal.
All right, we began with the Jean-Claude Juncker State of the European Union address, and we will end with it because I did speak to some MEPs and asked them what they really thought the State of the Union is.
My name is Gunnar Hökmark.
Nicola Danti from Italy, Socialist and Democrat Party.
Teresa Jimenez Becerril. I'm from the EPP Party.
Laura Ferrara from Five Star Movement. Martina Werner, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschland.
What is the real state of the European Union in one word?
Stable.
Lack of union.
Not so good.
Not strong enough.
What is the biggest success of the European Union?
Peace and freedom.
The enlargement.
The vote against Hungary.
Improvement in economic.
I don't know.
What is the biggest failure?
The lack of participation of citizens.
Immigration.
Not to speak with one voice in all issues.
Not having fulfilled all the reforms.
Too much failure.
Viktor Orban in one word.
Too nationalist.
Beyond the borders of our values.
Dictator.
Bad.
Do you think that reflected the real feeling towards the State
I liked
of the Union?
how is the State of the Union not so good, which I think is the view potentially of lots of European Union citizens.
Yeah, I would call it fragile, to be honest with you. There has been significant progress in a lot of areas in recent years, but it doesn't overwhelm the big structural challenges that the EU faces, the big geopolitical problems that it's now facing around Brexit. A few directives, a few communications don't compensate for that.
Are you optimistic about the change in relationship between Parliament and Commission once you have the new Commission in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think, whoever makes up Parliament and or the Commission, and indeed things have changed, but those institutional barriers are still too great. And it comes back to the fundamental problem of the European Union, is essentially, if you want more Europe, it's very difficult to try and get it because of the national sentiments. And if you want less Europe, it's quite difficult because you're not going to trust the European Union, because clearly a lot of people here, and as Jean-Claude Juncker made it today, want more of Europe. And that is where it's been torn. And in part, it's seen at its strongest in that East-West divide, which actually Jean-Claude Juncker said was one of his greatest regrets today.
Indeed, indeed. All right, so now we have time for today's raw moment. It was Jean-Claude Juncker's big day. Now, full marks for punctuality, but just a shame the other MEPs didn't get the memo. I do have to say they did eventually show up. And I mean, if we remember the last time that Juncker was here, he was very angry that MEPs were not around. He said, this is ridiculous. You remember that?
They do this all the time. It happens when new commissioners arrive. MEPs are too busy getting coffee, being self-centred, talking to themselves. That is what politicians do. But you would think that an institution struggling to get more power and prove its credibility would maybe be a little bit more self-reflective.
Yeah, and I feel a bit sorry for Jean-Claude Juncker. Also, he's clearly not very good on his feet at the moment, and so it's a long walk down. He wants to be prepared. It's not great. It's not great. I mean, I don't know what you kind of think. What the legacy of what do you think the legacy of Jean-Claude Juncker is going to be?
Honestly, it's going to be that he promised a political commission and couldn't completely deliver it. It was big words, not always delivered on, and Brexit. That's what will be in the history book.
Can any commission president deliver?
Well, I mean, that is the constraining thing. I think for me, I'm going to say he's like George III, not in the sense that he's gone mad, or was likely to go mad, but George III obviously remembered as the King of England that lost the Americas. And I think whatever happens, even the next 9 months, he will always be remembered as the president where Brexit took place under his stewardship.
All right, thank you for that, Darren, and of course, Ryan Heath from Politico Europe. And thank you for watching us tonight on Raw Politics. We'd like to hear your views. Tell us what you're talking about. I'm on Twitter at Tessa Arcilia, or follow us on Twitter at euronews using the hashtag Raw Politics. Have a good evening.